Her daughter-in-law read a fake will aloud, in Ellie Rawlins' own backyard. The guests sat in stunned silence. Ellie, widowed matriarch and lifelong strategist, sipped her iced tea and said nothing. Vanessa smiled like she'd already won. The house, the estate, the legacy. But Ellie's real will had been signed weeks ago, witnessed, sealed, and sent. By the time Vanessa opened that envelope, the inheritance was gone, the footage was live, and the trust belonged to someone else entirely. Ellie had spent a lifetime protecting her family. Now she was protecting the truth. And when Vanessa finally realized what she'd lost, Ellie didn't need to say a word. She already had the last one. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun warmed the backyard of the Rawlins estate, casting long shadows over the immaculate garden. A gentle breeze tugged at the tablecloths draped over the metal tables, and the air smelled faintly of charred cedar and roasting marshmallows from the fire pits that had been set up around the yard. Guests in crisp summer attire milled about, chatting in low tones, clinking glasses of wine, and nibbling on charcuterie. The hum of the gathering blended with the occasional laughter and the crackling of the flames. Ellie sat in a wicker chair near the fire pit, her fingers delicately wrapped around a glass of iced tea. She smiled quietly to herself, watching the scene unfold with her usual controlled calm. The company, the atmosphere. It all felt so familiar, almost too familiar. Nothing had ever felt more staged, more like a slow dance of masked intentions. And yet, she didn't flinch. Not once. Vanessa, on the other hand, stood at the center of it all, as if she were a natural-born queen, commanding attention without so much as raising her voice. Her smile was too wide, her laugh too bright. She held a glass of champagne in one hand, the other smoothing down the fabric of her dress like a rehearsed gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, tapping her glass with a dainty finger. The chatter died down almost immediately, the shift in energy subtle but noticeable. All eyes turned toward her, waiting. "I just want to share something special with all of you." Ellie's gaze never left her. She sipped her iced tea, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The world around her seemed to quiet, the space between the words narrowing like a drawn bowstring. Vanessa, with a theatrical flair, pulled out a thick stack of papers, folding them with a delicate snap before she cleared her throat. "To my beloved Vanessa, the house and everything in it." The words hung in the air, thick and bold, as if they were meant to hang over the entire gathering like a banner. Ellie could feel the weight of it, the momentary pause in the conversation, the undercurrent of tension as people exchanged glances. Jonas shifted in his seat, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his wineglass. Natalie stared, the screen of her phone illuminated in her lap. Dana's eyes narrowed, the lines around her mouth tightening with a barely contained suspicion. But Ellie? She remained still, her face a mask of measured calm. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She simply watched. Vanessa continued, her voice syrupy and smooth, savoring every syllable as if she could taste the sweetness of each word. "To my beloved Vanessa, the house and everything in it. The cars, the artwork, the jewelry, everything." Jonah coughed, his discomfort palpable now. His voice was quiet, though his question sliced through the tension like a sharp knife. "Mom, this is real?" Ellie's lips twitched into a faint smile. She didn't answer immediately, allowing the silence to stretch before she offered him only a single, unhurried glance. Her voice, when it came, was soft, measured. "Is it?" she asked, as though it were a question that didn't really need an answer. Vanessa, oblivious or willfully blind to the growing unease around her, pressed on. She read the will with exaggerated precision, every word a claim, a stake. To my daughter-in-law Vanessa, who has been such an important part of my life, I leave the entirety of the estate. She paused for effect, and though she spoke as if it were a profound declaration, Ellie's unblinking gaze bore into her, as if she were reading something far beyond the words. Jonah's unease deepened. His fidgeting grew more pronounced as he shifted in his seat, glancing from Vanessa to Ellie, back to the papers in Vanessa's hands. Natalie's phone continued to hum softly under the table, recording everything. Her eyes trained on the scene with something unreadable in her gaze. She had no need to say a word. Her silence was enough. Dana shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her sharp gaze moving between Ellie and Vanessa, a quiet tension building behind her pursed lips. She whispered something under her breath, just loud enough for Ellie to hear. "Since when do you give speeches from the grave?" Ellie didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge Dana's words out loud. She simply took another sip of her iced tea, the glass cool against her fingers. Her expression, like the rest of the afternoon, remained composed, controlled. Vanessa paused, perhaps sensing the rippling disquiet around her, but the moment passed. With a false smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she closed the will and folded it back into her hand, her gaze sweeping over the party. "Thank you for letting me share that with you all," she said, her tone wrapping itself in layers of false warmth. No one clapped, no one cheered. The tension hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. People shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks that only Ellie seemed to notice. And still, she said nothing. She simply smiled into her glass of tea, her gaze never leaving Vanessa. As the crowd murmured around her, Ellie felt something click into place. The game had begun, and she would let Vanessa play, at least for a little while longer. But the end was already written. The question now was how long it would take for everyone else to catch up. The moment Vanessa folded the will back into her hands, the air grew thick with unease. The soft hum of conversation resumed, but it was quieter now, the energy dampened by the heaviness of what had just been read aloud. The fire crackled too loudly, almost unnervingly so, as the flames danced higher, their orange glow painting the faces of the gathered guests in flickering light. Jonah sat back in his chair, his brow furrowed, clearly unsettled. His fingers tapped an erratic rhythm on the edge of his glass, a restless pulse he couldn't seem to control. He glanced around, unsure of what to say, his eyes landing on Ellie before darting quickly away. His lips parted, as if he was about to speak, but nothing came out. He stared at Vanessa, then back at his mother, unable to piece together the situation. Dana, sitting nearby, leaned in slightly, her voice a soft hiss as if she were sharing a secret. "Since when do you give speeches from the grave?" Ellie didn't flinch at the remark. She merely lifted her glass of iced tea to her lips, taking another slow, deliberate sip. Her eyes, calm and unwavering, were locked on Vanessa as though she were studying a puzzle that didn't quite fit. She hadn't corrected Vanessa, hadn't reacted to the false will in any way. Her silence was like an invisible weight, pressing down on everyone else. Vanessa, as though trying to hold on to the narrative she had created, cleared her throat and smiled widely, her eyes scanning the room. "I just thought it was important that you all hear it from me first," she said, raising her chin with exaggerated confidence. "Ellie gave me her permission to read it aloud. I thought you'd all want to know her wishes directly." A few guests nodded uncertainly, but the tension in the air was palpable. The murmurs from the gathering were quiet now, but the ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd like an electric charge. A polite smile was offered here and there, but there were no cheers, no applause, just a collective waiting, as if everyone were waiting for something to happen that they didn't understand. Natalie sat at the far end of the table, her phone in her lap, her fingers tapping the screen. Her gaze flicked from Vanessa to Ellie, but her expression remained unreadable. She wasn't participating in the conversation. Instead, she was a silent observer, capturing every moment, every word. The phone screen glowed faintly as she recorded, her thumb moving carefully over the buttons, uploading the footage to an anonymous account. Ellie's gaze never wavered. She didn't look at Natalie. She didn't need to. Her silence was a statement of its own. She had nothing to add to the spectacle unfolding before her. Nothing needed to be said. Jonah glanced again at his mother, his discomfort growing by the second. He was still processing what had just happened, the declaration of Vanessa inheriting everything. "Mom," he started again, his voice low and uncertain. "Are you sure about this? I mean, is this really what you wanted?" Ellie's lips barely moved, her eyes flicking to him for a brief moment. Her response, when it came, was almost imperceptible, as if she were simply affirming the air itself. "Is it?" she asked softly, her tone suggesting that no further answer was required. The words hung there, suspended in the silence between them. Vanessa's grip on the papers tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing her face, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she plastered that same practiced smile on her face and turned back to the guests. "I'm just so glad to be able to share this with all of you today. Thank you for being here. It means so much to me." Her voice was smooth, too smooth, each word a polished pearl strung together by the weight of entitlement. But beneath it, there was a thread of uncertainty, a small crack that no one was quite sure how to acknowledge. Ellie leaned back in her chair, resting one hand on the armrest, her gaze never leaving Vanessa. She exhaled slowly, watching the way the words seemed to hang in the air. There was nothing in her expression that suggested she would act, or even react. She was letting it unfold, letting Vanessa dig her own hole. The murmurs continued around the garden, but they were softer now, more hushed. Conversations had stopped, replaced with awkward glances and half-hearted attempts at small talk. No one knew exactly what to say. No one but Ellie. Ellie thanked the guests for coming, her voice warm but distant. "I'm glad everyone could join us today. It's been a lovely gathering." She said the words as if she were welcoming them all to a routine dinner, not a staged spectacle. No corrections, no defenses, just the steady calm of someone who had already seen the end of this play unfold in her mind. Dana leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "You're being awfully calm," she said, her voice low but heavy with meaning. Ellie didn't meet her gaze immediately. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the words in her mind before answering. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, she replied, "I've learned that silence often speaks louder than words." Her words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but they settled over the group like a heavy fog. The statement, simple as it was, held far more weight than anyone realized. And as Ellie looked at her guests one last time, her gaze lingering just a fraction longer on Vanessa, it became clear. The game wasn't over yet. It had barely begun, and Ellie was already 10 steps ahead. The early evening sun cast a faint glow over the streets of Boulder, Colorado, as Ellie made her way down the winding roads toward Roger Devlin's office. The city, with its soft hum of urban life and the occasional rush of a passing car, seemed a world away from the tension hanging over her family. Her hands rested lightly on the wheel, and her thoughts were a quiet, steady stream. Nothing had truly surprised her. Not the party, not Vanessa's audacity. It had all been carefully planned, as always. Ellie had known this moment would come. She'd just been waiting for the right time to let it unfold. As the wheels of the car rolled smoothly across the pavement, her mind remained anchored in the purpose of this drive. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even irritated. Vanessa's little show had been nothing more than a calculated misstep in a game Ellie had already won. Pulling into the small, discreet parking lot outside Roger's office, Ellie parked with her usual precision. The building, a modern structure with glass windows and clean lines, stood stark against the surrounding trees. It felt like a place where secrets were stored and truths were carefully hidden. The perfect setting for what she was about to do. She stepped out of the car, smooth and composed as ever, the soft click of her heels echoing in the quiet air. With a brief pause, she adjusted the strap of her handbag, the contents heavy with purpose. Ellie had never been the type to rush. Each step she took was deliberate, controlled. Roger Devlin's office door opened with a soft click as she pushed it, entering the space where business was conducted in whispers and signatures. It smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, a scent that Ellie had come to associate with finality. Roger sat behind his desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his ever-calm demeanor unbroken. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, but there was something eternally precise about the way he moved. He didn't rise when she entered. There was no need. Ellie was his equal in every sense, and they both knew it. "Ellie," Roger greeted, his voice a quiet rasp. "What brings you here today?" Without a word, Ellie pulled a small USB drive from her bag and slid it across the polished wood of the desk. Along with it, she placed a thick envelope, the contents unmistakable. Roger's eyes flickered over the items before he raised his gaze to her. He was calculating, measuring. He had always been good at that. "I'm activating the sealed version per our last agreement," Ellie said, her voice cool and confident. Roger didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, inspecting the USB with a practiced eye. "She really read from a fake document? Out loud?" The words were almost a question, but his tone suggested something deeper. A curiosity, yes, but also an acknowledgement that he knew this moment was more than just legal maneuvering. Ellie's lips curved into a faint smile. She didn't answer him immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to punctuate her calm control. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but certain. "On camera, in front of witnesses, in pearls?" There was a moment's pause as Roger processed that. The faintest flicker of surprise crossed his face, though he quickly masked it behind a professional mask. "I'll prep the final reveal," he said, already reaching for the USB and the envelope. His fingers brushed over the thick paper, his mind no doubt already running through the legal steps he would need to take next. Ellie remained still, watching him with an almost detached interest. She had known Roger for years, trusted him with everything. He was meticulous, precise, and never once had he failed to deliver on their agreements. But this was something more. This was the final act of a play that had been building for decades. She glanced out the window, her eyes tracing the faint outline of the mountains in the distance. The quiet of the room seemed almost oppressive now, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. The world beyond the office seemed distant, almost irrelevant. In this space, with Roger, Ellie was in control, and the world would have to reckon with that. "I'll prepare everything as discussed," Roger continued, his voice pulling her back from her thoughts. He was already pulling up files on his computer, the steady rhythm of his typing filling the air between them. The steps, the procedures. They were all set in motion now. Ellie stood, smoothing down her jacket as she made her way to the door. As her hand touched the handle, she turned back toward Roger. "Make sure the video gets into the right hands," she said, her voice laced with a quiet but unmistakable command. "It's not just about the will, Roger. It's about the truth." Roger gave her a short nod, his expression unreadable. "Understood." With a final glance, Ellie stepped out of the office, the door clicking shut behind her. As she walked back to her car, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over her. The pieces were all in place. The plan had been set into motion, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. Ellie's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly as she started the engine, but her expression remained serene. The drive back would be the same as the one that had brought her here, calm, measured, and in control. Vanessa had made her move. Now it was Ellie's turn to show the world what silence and strategy could really achieve. And the final reveal? It was going to be much more than anyone expected. The evening air had cooled significantly since the party, and the sharp bite of a fall breeze slipped through the cracks in the windows of the Rollins estate. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, the weight of what had been said lingering like a fog. Ellie sat at the kitchen island, the gentle clink of her teaspoon against the edge of her cup the only sound in the room. Dana had stopped by earlier that afternoon, just long enough to pass a cryptic comment about the Will incident and linger in the hallway with a knowing look. But it was her words now, spoken a few hours ago, that echoed in Ellie's mind. "You're sure about what you're doing?" Dana had asked, her voice cautious, though she'd never doubted Ellie's decisions before. "I've learned to play the long game," Ellie had replied, the words hanging in the air like a quiet challenge. But it wasn't just Dana who'd noticed the lie Vanessa had told. Ellie knew the guests had seen the cracks, even if they'd remained silent about them. There had been something in their eyes, a flicker of doubt, a subtle shift of disbelief when Vanessa had announced her supposed inheritance. The damage was already done, but the truth was coming, inch by careful inch. Dana had called not long after Ellie left Roger's office. She'd seen something that Ellie had expected, but Dana's words made it more tangible. "That paper wasn't notarized." I looked. Ellie hadn't reacted to the news. She'd simply nodded. Dana's sharp eye for detail would have been the first to catch such an obvious flaw, and now, the first thread of Vanessa's web had begun to unravel. As the phone call ended, Ellie sat in silence. Her eyes fixed on the same place she had been staring at for hours, the back patio, still lit from the flickering embers of the fire. Her thoughts were quiet, ordered, but there was a small part of her, some distant, buried part, that was surprised by how much the charade had affected the people she loved. How could they fall for it so easily? Then again, it was a question she knew the answer to. They were all so desperate to believe, to trust in the illusion. From the corner of the kitchen, Ellie heard the faint buzz of her granddaughter's phone. Natalie had been quiet since the party, not saying much, but Ellie had known she was observing, documenting. As much as Ellie had prepared herself for everything to go according to plan, she hadn't been prepared for how much she would need Natalie's silence, her participation. In that moment, Ellie was aware of the young woman's role and she understood the weight of it. With a soft sigh, Ellie stood up, moving slowly toward the door where Natalie sat at the table, her phone still open in front of her. "Got something to show me?" Ellie asked, her voice soft but carrying an edge of expectation. Natalie didn't look up at first. She let the silence stretch between them for a moment, as though weighing her options. Then she slid the phone across the table, the screen flickering as it loaded. Ellie picked it up, her thumb moving instinctively across the screen. There it was, Vanessa's speech, captured in its entirety, the moment frozen in time. It was an almost too perfect recording, the camera steady, the voices clear, the lies woven seamlessly into the fabric of the evening. "You filmed it?" Ellie asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the small, blinking red light in the corner of the phone. Natalie simply nodded. "Had to. You never know what'll come in handy." Ellie studied the screen for a long moment before returning the phone to Natalie. There were no words. There was no need. The evidence was irrefutable, and the world would soon see what Vanessa had tried to hide. "Thank you," Ellie said, her voice low, almost like a whisper. She turned, making her way toward the living room, the weight of what was about to happen settling on her shoulders like a second skin. Once there, she sat down at her desk, her fingers brushing over the keys of her laptop as she logged into her social media account. Without a word, she navigated to her page, the familiar world of her carefully curated online life stretched out in front of her. The notifications, the messages, the questions, it would all need to be erased, wiped clean. Her eyes narrowed, focused. Ellie scrolled to the settings, her thumb hovering over the delete button. She hesitated only for a moment before confirming. It was the right move, the only move. The world would come to know the truth soon enough. And when they did, nothing she had built in that space would matter. She had learned long ago that the truth had a way of making itself known, and it never needed a platform. All that mattered now was what happened next. Her social media account was gone in an instant. The silence left behind felt satisfying. The act itself was almost ceremonial. Ellie leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest as she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. And as she sat there, the last few threads of Vanessa's lies slowly unraveling in the real world, Ellie allowed herself a small smile. The game was nearing its end. The morning after the party, Vanessa could still feel the weight of her triumph. She'd pulled off the speech flawlessly, hadn't she? Everyone had been so stunned, so caught up in the moment. Her heart had raced, but only because she knew what was coming next. The inheritance, the house, the life she'd been calculating toward for years. But now, with the wind still fresh in her hair and the promise of her new future so close, there was a knot in her stomach. The questions started to creep in. Why hadn't Ellie corrected her? Was she pretending to be calm? Or was there something more to it? Something she didn't know yet? Vanessa had only just parked in front of Roger Devlin's office when the unsettling realization hit her. She'd never actually seen the original will. Ellie had made the arrangements, signed everything, but Vanessa hadn't been allowed to see a copy. Of course, she'd known all along that Ellie was too clever for her own good. But had she been too clever? Even for Vanessa? As Vanessa strode into Roger's office with the confidence of someone who believed they already owned everything, her heels clicked sharply on the marble floor. The receptionist barely glanced up before she gestured toward the door. Vanessa took a deep breath, pushing the handle open with an exaggerated flourish, expecting to find Roger waiting for her, ready to finish up what had already been set in motion. Roger sat behind his desk, his back straight and his expression neutral. There was no smile, no hint of warmth, only the faintest touch of recognition in his eyes as she entered. It was almost as if he'd been expecting her. "Vanessa," he greeted, his tone as steady and unbothered as it had always been. "What brings you here today?" Vanessa wasted no time in seating herself. She was ready for this conversation, ready for the inevitable access she would finally get to Ellie's will. She reached into her bag, pulling out a sleek folder as she leaned forward, placing it on the desk between them with a sense of finality. "I'm here to take a look at the file. I just need to confirm a few details," she said, her voice smooth, casual. She wanted him to think she was still in control, despite the flickering uncertainty now clouding her thoughts. Roger didn't move to open the file immediately. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his hands steepled in front of him. "Funny," he replied coolly. "I already spoke with Ellie directly." Vanessa's pulse quickened, but she masked her discomfort with a forced smile. "She told me you'd be expecting me," she said smoothly. "I just need a glance at the file. The details, you know." She gestured as if she was entitled to it, her voice betraying a hint of impatience now. Roger paused, then leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. The silence hung in the air for a moment, thick with unspoken truths. Finally, he reached for the drawer on his desk and pulled out a plain envelope, sliding it across to her. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. The envelope was unmarked, the kind of paperwork she had no interest in. She opened it, only to find a single sheet of paper. It was a blank authorization form. She blinked. The words didn't register at first. She looked back up at Roger, confusion flooding her chest. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight. Roger met her gaze, his expression unchanged. "Feel free to fill this out with Ellie present," he said flatly. "I can't give you access to the file without her consent." Vanessa stared at him, her thoughts momentarily splintered. "What do you mean? Without her consent?" She couldn't hide the edge of panic creeping into her voice now. "She gave me permission, Roger. She told me I could read the will." Roger didn't flinch. "You should have brought her with you," he replied calmly, his tone devoid of sympathy. "Without her, there's nothing I can do." For a long moment, Vanessa just stared at him. Her fingers trembled around the blank form, the sharp reality of the situation cutting through the fog she'd so carefully woven. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to be the way it went. She reached for the envelope, gripping it tightly, her mind racing. Her mouth went dry as a fresh wave of frustration and panic surged through her. How could this be happening? Ellie hadn't given her the full story. Ellie had played her. "You're telling me I can't even see it?" Vanessa snapped, her voice rising in disbelief. "This is my inheritance. My right. I have a right to know what's happening." Roger's eyes remained fixed on her, calm and unyielding. "I'm sorry, but you'll need Ellie's signature, in person. That's the procedure. No exceptions." Vanessa's face flushed with anger. She wanted to shout, to demand, to break down the calm facade of this office, but instead she stood, forcing herself to control the outburst that burned in her chest. "Fine," she spat. "I'll get her. But this isn't over, Roger." Her heels clicked louder now, faster, as she turned on her heel and stormed out of the office, the door swinging shut behind her with a finality that felt like a warning. Outside, the air felt colder than before. The facade had cracked, and Vanessa now realized, with growing dread, that the game was far from over. Ellie had been 2 steps ahead, and now, it seemed, there was no way to catch up. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Rollins estate's breakfast room, casting long, soft shadows across the polished hardwood floor. The quiet hum of a few scattered conversations filled the air, punctuated by the clink of silverware and the occasional sound of a chair scraping against the floor. The breakfast spread was elegant, as it always was: fresh croissants, neatly arranged fruit, the sharp aroma of coffee filling the room. Vanessa sat at the far end of the table, her posture straight, her smile wide, talking animatedly to the family friends who had gathered. She was doing most of the talking, of course, her voice lilting with false warmth, as if the last few days hadn't been filled with lies and uncertainty. She was the queen of the conversation, and she had a story to tell. "The house, the estate, everything's just waiting for me now," she said, her voice dripping with pride. "It's really quite overwhelming, you know. I've already started thinking about the remodel, the grand staircase, the new marble floors." She gestured expansively, as if she were already stepping through the newly renovated halls of her future. A few people nodded, half listening, half hoping for an opening to speak. Vanessa's voice carried, smooth and insistent, as she continued to embellish every detail with flourish. The others smiled and exchanged glances, but there was an edge to her tone that only Ellie, sitting nearby, could truly hear. Vanessa was desperate, trying to fill the silence that had become too much for her to bear. Ellie sat at the table, her hands folded calmly in front of her, sipping her tea. Her eyes never left Vanessa, but her face was unreadable, gently serene, like someone watching a puppet perform a final act without bothering to interfere. She'd played her part, and now she was content to let Vanessa continue digging her own hole. Vanessa caught Ellie's gaze at one point and gave a tight smile, as if daring Ellie to challenge her. Ellie's response was subtle, a small, almost imperceptible tilt of her head as she met her daughter-in-law's stare. She said nothing, simply let the tension hang between them like a quiet storm. She didn't need to speak. "It's always strange hearing your own obituary," Ellie said suddenly, her voice soft but cutting through the air with surgical precision. Her words were calm, even detached, but there was a weight to them that silenced the conversation around the table. Vanessa faltered, the bright smile freezing for just a fraction of a second. The other guests shifted awkwardly, unsure whether they should laugh or look away. Vanessa opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. She quickly regained composure, but Ellie's words hung in the air, stark against the fake warmth of her earlier boast. Natalie, sitting off to the side, watched the scene unfold from behind her phone. Her eyes never left the screen as she silently filmed the moment, her thumb moving quickly to upload the footage to a secure file. She was already documenting, capturing every subtle movement of her family's destruction. The quiet buzz of the upload was barely audible, but Ellie, of course, noticed. She always noticed. As the silence stretched just long enough for everyone to squirm, Dana leaned over from her seat across the table. She passed Ellie a small, folded note, her eyes sharp with knowing. Ellie unfolded the note, her expression remaining unchanged. It was short and to the point. "Date set?" Without missing a beat, Ellie glanced at the paper, then back at Dana. She answered, almost too calmly. "The desk is dusted." Dana's eyes twinkled with understanding, a slight nod accompanying the smirk that curved at the corners of her lips. She said nothing more, but Ellie could see the wheels turning in her friend's mind. Dana had been by her side through everything, always just as sharp as Ellie herself, always prepared to strike when the time was right. Jonah, seated a few places away, looked up from his plate. His brow furrowed as he glanced between Ellie and Vanessa. Something was off. He could feel it, even if he couldn't quite put it into words. He'd been quiet the entire morning, picking at his food, not engaging in the casual conversation like everyone else. Finally, after a long moment of hesitation, he spoke. "Mom," he started, his voice low as if testing the waters. "It's generous of you, the way you've set everything up for Vanessa. I didn't expect this." Ellie met his eyes, her gaze steady and unwavering. She didn't smile, didn't even react, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of something unreadable, that made Jonah hesitate. She didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch between them, and when she finally spoke, her words were deceptively simple. "Is it?" she asked softly, her voice so calm, so measured. The question lingered in the air, a quiet challenge, as if daring Jonah to dig deeper. Jonah blinked, unsure of how to respond. There was a flicker of doubt in his expression now, a crack in the armor he'd always worn so comfortably. The doubt didn't come from Ellie's words, but from the sudden realization that something wasn't adding up. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. He just felt it. The weight of everything, the shift in the room. It felt wrong. Vanessa's face tightened, her smile strained as she quickly returned to her conversation with the other guests. But Ellie was no longer paying attention to her. Her eyes flicked to the other side of the table, watching Jonah with quiet interest, noting the subtle changes in his posture, the way he shifted in his seat. The pieces were falling into place, and Ellie knew that, sooner or later, everyone would be forced to confront the truth. But for now, she would let them keep playing the game. Because when the truth came, it would be too late to turn back. The evening arrived like an opulent cloud, draped in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers and the delicate scent of freshly prepared French cuisine. The Rollins estate felt like a stage set for something grand, a momentous occasion carefully crafted and rehearsed. Vanessa's grand dinner was her declaration, her subtle victory over the family, an opportunity to showcase what she believed was now hers by right. The dining room was arranged with meticulous care. The long table gleamed under the warm light, laden with a spread that screamed excess: roasted duck with figs, truffled mashed potatoes, golden-crusted baguettes, and an assortment of rich French wines. Engraved place cards sat at each setting, each one bearing a name, except for Ellie's. Ellie, of course, was seated at the head of the table. Vanessa's eyes sparkled with ambition, the kind of ambition that had always simmered under her polished exterior. She moved through the room like a conductor preparing to start an orchestra. The guests were all familiar faces, family friends who had spent years in the Rollins orbit, their smiles strained in a way that made their appreciation seem rehearsed. Ellie sat at the head, her posture dignified, her hands resting lightly on the table as she surveyed the room. Her presence was a quiet force, the kind that made the room hold its breath. The other guests, in their finery, looked to her not for permission but for acknowledgement, a subtle shift in dynamic that only Ellie could command. Vanessa raised her glass, her voice ringing out, cutting through the murmur of conversation. "To legacy, vision, and gratitude," she said, her words rehearsed but eager. "May this evening remind us of what truly matters: family, trust, and what's to come." Her smile was dazzling, but there was a slight tremor in it, something Ellie had learned to read as desperation. Vanessa held the glass high, her eyes scanning the room for approval, her gaze pausing briefly on Ellie before she took a sip. Ellie didn't raise her glass. She simply watched Vanessa, her gaze sharp, piercing. Her silence spoke volumes, but she made no move to acknowledge the toast. She had learned that sometimes the silence was louder than any applause. Jonah sat across from Ellie, his hand nervously swirling the wine in his glass. He wasn't paying attention to the toast. Instead, his eyes kept flicking between his mother and his wife, a barely perceptible tension building in the air. The smile on his face was forced, a tightness around his eyes that was hard to miss. He had noticed the cracks, the undercurrent of things that weren't being said, and it was eating away at him. The lavishness of the dinner, the extravagant gestures, the fake warmth. It all felt like a charade. He took a long sip of his wine, his eyes now darting to Natalie. She sat next to him, her expression distant, her fork barely touching her food. She avoided eye contact, keeping her face down, her eyes focused on her plate. Ellie's glance caught Natalie's for a brief moment, and though there was no exchange of words, Ellie understood. Her granddaughter had always been the keenest observer, the quiet one who saw everything without speaking a word. "Not hungry?" Ellie's voice was quiet, soft, but the question held weight. It wasn't a critique, just an observation. Natalie's lips parted for a moment as if she were about to speak, but instead, she simply shook her head. "I'm fine," she murmured, offering only the smallest of smiles. She pushed her food around the plate, though none of it seemed to reach her mouth. Ellie let it go, her gaze moving once more to Vanessa. The dinner had all the trappings of celebration, but Ellie knew better. This was the moment before everything unraveled. The effort Vanessa was putting into keeping up appearances, to sell the lie, was growing thin. But Ellie didn't need to rush it. The truth would reveal itself in time. Dana, seated further down the table, was more engaged with the quiet click of her phone than with the conversation happening around her. Her fingers moved rapidly over the screen, her brow furrowed as she typed quickly, the glow of the phone casting a faint light on her face. Ellie noticed the small glances Dana sent her way. The knowing looks passed between them. Dana had always been Ellie's ally, sharp as a tack, and always in the loop. Ellie was certain that Dana was sending a message, keeping the wheels in motion. The plan was coming together. Jonah looked at Ellie again, his discomfort evident now. He cleared his throat, as though trying to find his footing in a conversation that no longer felt familiar. "Mom," he started, his voice quieter than before. "What do you think? About the future, I mean. About everything." Ellie didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a slow sip from her glass, her eyes steady, calculating. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, before she answered. "I think," she said, her voice low but cutting, "that sometimes the future takes care of itself. And sometimes we get to decide how it plays out." Jonah's face paled slightly, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. But no words came. Instead, he looked down at his plate, his unease now palpable. Ellie's gaze softened just slightly, but her next words were deliberate. "Trust," she continued, her voice almost a whisper, "is a fragile thing. Once broken, it's not easily repaired." The dinner continued around her, the clinking of silverware and murmured conversations filling the air, but Ellie remained the center of the room. She let the moment settle, the words hanging in the air like a weighted cloud. And Vanessa, so sure of her position, continued to talk. She continued to sell the lie. But Ellie knew the truth was just around the corner, and when it came, there would be no pretending. The early morning light was cool and muted as Ellie stepped into Roger Devlin's office, the faint scent of leather and old paper greeting her. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the air carrying a sense of finality. It was a place where decisions were made, where lives were changed with a single signature. And today, Ellie was here to make hers. Dana followed her inside, her steps light but purposeful. She wasn't just there as a witness. She was Ellie's partner in this. Always perceptive, always calculating, Dana had kept an eye on every detail, making sure nothing was left to chance. She took her place in the corner of the room, her gaze sharp and focused as Ellie approached Roger's desk. Roger sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him as he regarded Ellie. The man was always composed, the kind of person who never revealed too much. His presence in the room was more of a formality now. Ellie had already decided everything that needed deciding. He was there to facilitate, nothing more. "Morning, Ellie," Roger said, his voice calm, but with a slight edge of anticipation. "You're ready to move forward?" Ellie nodded, her eyes steady. She reached into her bag and withdrew the thick file she'd carried with her, a copy of the will, the original documents, the notary statement. It was all set, all prepared, the final step in a long game. "I'm ready," Ellie replied, her voice low but unwavering. She placed the file on the desk in front of Roger. The cool air of the office seemed to hum around them, the moment ripe with weight and significance. Roger opened the file, flipping through the pages with practiced hands. The will was there, neatly signed, each page sealed and stamped. The sections were clear and simple. The house was to go to Natalie. The cash trust was designated to the Community Girls Program, something Ellie had supported for years. But as he skimmed the document, Roger's eyes stopped briefly on the parts that mattered most. Vanessa and Jonah were not mentioned. Zero. Nothing. "Everything's in order," Roger said as he closed the file and slid it toward Ellie. "I'll take this to the probate clerk, and we'll begin the process immediately." His tone was almost clinical, as if he were talking about the weather. But there was a faint flicker of something in his eyes, recognition perhaps, of just how deep Ellie's plan ran. He knew this was no ordinary will. This was a declaration. Ellie took the file from him, her fingers brushing over the pages. She didn't need to look at it again. She already knew every word, every clause. But she had one more thing to add, one more detail that would seal everything in place. She pulled out a separate sheet of paper from the folder and slid it over to Roger. It was a statement of intent, short, sharp, to the point. A final reminder of why this had to happen. Roger glanced at it, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't speak, but Ellie saw him process the weight of her words. The statement wasn't about money or property. It was about trust, about everything Vanessa had destroyed. It was a declaration of what Ellie stood for, of who would truly inherit the legacy. She spoke, her voice unwavering. "Make sure that goes with the will when it's filed." Roger nodded, his hands slow as he set the statement aside. "I'll make sure it's done." His gaze met Ellie's, and for the briefest moment there was an understanding between them. It wasn't just about the legalities anymore. It was about something deeper, something that Ellie had been preparing for, quietly, for years. A soft click of the pen. A quiet sigh. Then Roger looked back at her with a question. "Want me to notify her now?" Ellie's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, the kind that came when she knew she had already won. "Let her find it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The waiting was over. The plan was in motion. Vanessa had played her hand, had made her move. And now, she would have to live with the consequences. Ellie didn't need to confront her. She didn't need to explain anything. The truth would come to Vanessa soon enough, in its cold, undeniable form. Ellie turned and walked toward the door, Dana following a few steps behind her, silent as ever. They didn't need words now. The game had been played, and the pieces were already set in motion. As Ellie stepped out into the bright morning air, she didn't look back. The path ahead was clear. She had outmaneuvered everyone, and now, all that remained was the inevitable fallout. And Vanessa? She would be the last to know. Vanessa's heels clicked against the polished floor as she strode into Roger Devlin's office, her head held high, her eyes sharp with confidence. It was early afternoon now, and she'd barely slept, her mind racing with the victory she thought she had secured the night before. The dinner had gone perfectly, her performance flawless, everyone eager to offer congratulations. As far as Vanessa was concerned, the estate was already hers. Roger's office was as she remembered, clean, efficient, and cold. The air smelled of leather-bound books and faint cologne, the kind of atmosphere that signaled nothing but business. Vanessa paused at the door, straightening her jacket, her smile slipping into place. This was the moment when everything would fall into place. Roger was seated behind his desk as usual, his posture immaculate, his fingers steepled. The moment he saw her, a flicker of recognition passed through his eyes, but there was no warmth in his expression. The transaction had been made, the lines had been drawn. Now, all that was left was the formality of finalizing the process. "Vanessa," Roger greeted her, his tone neutral, his gaze flicking over her as if assessing the confidence radiating from her. "What brings you here today?" Vanessa held up a hand, her smile tightening as she stepped closer to his desk. "I've come for the final documents," she said smoothly. "You said I could see the will, and I'd like to get everything sorted out." Her voice was sharp, but underneath, a tremor of impatience lingered. Roger didn't immediately respond. He reached under his desk, pulling out a thick envelope marked with bold, official lettering. He slid it toward her, the flap sealed with the unmistakable signature of authenticity. "Here you go," he said, his voice flat as he watched her. "Confidential, V. Rollins." Vanessa's pulse quickened, a giddy rush surging through her as she gripped the envelope. It was the key, the final step. The house, the estate, everything was hers. She couldn't wait to tear into it, to see her name in the will. The paperwork had already been filed. She was about to become the rightful heir. "Thank you," she said with a tight smile, turning on her heel without another word. She walked briskly to the car waiting outside, her mind already leaping ahead to what she would do next. As she slid into the back seat, the driver closed the door behind her, the soft hum of the engine starting to pull her away from the office. The envelope trembled slightly in her hands as she ripped it open, her fingers working quickly to peel back the flap. The contents inside were neatly arranged: a notarized summary of the will, a copy of the official documents, a flash drive, everything she'd expected. But as she scanned the contents, her heart began to race. She was expecting pages filled with instructions and formalities. Instead, the first sentence of the summary stopped her cold. The estate of Eleanor Rollins is hereby bequeathed in full to her granddaughter Natalie Rollins. She blinked, her mind slowing to a halt, unable to process the words she had just read. Her hand shook as she turned the page. The rest was clear, concise, and damning. Vanessa Rollins and Jonah Rollins are excluded from all inheritance. 0. No assets or property to be distributed to either party. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. Excluded. She read the words again and again, as if trying to make them mean something else. Her mouth went dry and her heart pounded in her chest. This couldn't be right. The plan had been set. The will had been read. She had the house, didn't she? With trembling hands, she reached for the flash drive. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of mistake? A mix-up? Surely this wasn't real. She shoved the drive into the USB port of her phone, fingers pressing it in too forcefully. The screen blinked to life, and as the file opened, her eyes widened with shock. The video from the party, the one Vanessa had orchestrated, the one she'd read aloud to the guests, flashed across the screen. The file labeled "False Claim, 6 Witnesses Present" hovered at the top. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth as she watched the footage. Her own voice, clear and loud, as she read from the fake will. It was all there. The complete speech. The audience in stunned silence. The video continued, showing the party guests, Jonah and Dana, everyone witnessing her audacious claim. The final frame of the video showed Ellie, sipping her iced tea, calmly watching it all unfold. Vanessa's heart sank, her stomach twisted into a knot as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a will, this was a trap. Ellie had set her up. She had allowed Vanessa to make her move, knowing the entire time that the will had already been signed, already been set. Vanessa screamed in frustration, the sound ripping from her chest like a burst of fury. She shook her head, unable to comprehend what she had done. The driver didn't turn around. He sat still, staring ahead, the silence in the car thick and suffocating as Vanessa's world cracked apart. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will the truth away, but it was too late. The documents had already been signed, the truth had already been sealed, and Vanessa had been played. And now, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. The silence in the car was deafening. Vanessa stared out of the window, the streetlights flickering past as the driver navigated the winding roads away from Roger's office. The envelope, now discarded on the seat beside her, felt like a weight too heavy to bear. She could still see the words in her mind. The text she had read over and over. Vanessa Rollins and Jonah Rollins are excluded from all inheritance. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't supposed to be the one left with nothing. Everything had been so carefully arranged. She had played her part, and she had done it well. So why? Why had Ellie played her like this? The tears came suddenly, hot and overwhelming, and for a moment, Vanessa couldn't stop them. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with a fury she couldn't contain. How could she have been so foolish, so confident? She had been so sure, so certain. This was supposed to be mine. In the midst of her anger and despair, she pulled her phone from her purse, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it. She scrolled to Ellie's contact, her thumb hovering over the call button for a moment. But no. She needed something more, something to show that this was her fight, that she wasn't going to be pushed aside. Vanessa hit the voicemail button, her thumb shaking as she pressed it. The first voicemail was short, raw, her voice breaking as she struggled to maintain control. Ellie, I can't believe you would do this to me. This was mine. Everything was mine. You knew this. This was the plan. You. You let me embarrass myself in front of everyone. I. I thought you were on my side. And you just. She took a breath, trying to steady herself. I'm not going down like this, Ellie. You hear me? I'm not going down like this. Her finger hovered again, the words now coming in a rush, desperate, pleading. She hit the record button for the second time. Ellie, she said, her voice low and trembling. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. But you can't do this. You can't just take everything from me. I need that house. I need this. I did everything for you. For us. You can't leave me with nothing. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the tears mixing with her anger. Her voice turned darker. I'll fix this. I'll make sure you never get away with this. I'll make it right. Just, please, pick up the phone. Just talk to me. She paused, and when she spoke again, her words were hoarse, barely above a whisper. Please. She ended the call, only to immediately redial, her breath ragged as she left the third message. Ellie, please, please, I know you're watching this. You're watching me fall apart right now. But you have to understand, you've ruined everything. You've made me look like a fool. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to be treated like this. There was a pause, followed by a long, shaky breath. This was supposed to be mine, Ellie. It was all supposed to be mine. I did everything for this. For you. You're going to regret this. The phone beeped, signaling the end of her third voicemail. Without thinking, Vanessa hit the button again. The fourth message was louder, her voice rising with fury and desperation. You embarrassed me, Ellie. You embarrassed me. This was supposed to be mine, and you let me look like a damn fool in front of everyone. You knew the will was fake, but you let me do it anyway. You let me walk right into your trap. Her voice cracked as she shouted, This is it. I swear to God, I'll make you pay for this. You think you can just leave me with nothing? I'll make sure you regret it. She ended that voicemail, her breath ragged as she prepared to leave one last message, the words spilling out before she had time to think. Ellie, I'm not done. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I'll take what's mine, one way or another. Don't you dare think this is finished. The voicemail clicked off, and she slumped back in her seat, drained but still seething with anger. Across the car, the driver sat silent, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he couldn't hear her fury, couldn't feel her pain. But Vanessa's world had just shattered, and there was no place for silence now. No place for anything but her rage. The car came to a stop outside her house, but she didn't move, staring ahead at the darkened home before her. Her fingers ached to dial again, but there was nothing left to say, nothing left to give. The phone rang once, and then once more. A call from Jonah. She swiped the screen to answer but stopped herself. Her finger hovered over the phone, and for the first time in hours, she simply stared at the number. She let it ring out. The voicemail left was one more echo, a cry of frustration that would never be heard. Inside the house, Ellie was already moving forward. Ellie stood by the window, the soft golden light of the afternoon casting shadows across the floor of the sitting room. Her hand rested on the cool windowsill, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding outside. The Rollins estate, quiet and serene as it was, had become a backdrop for something much more intense. A slow, deliberate unraveling that Ellie had been anticipating for weeks. Vanessa was standing on the porch, her face flushed with fury, her hands flailing as she shouted. The words weren't clear, but the desperation was unmistakable. It was almost comical, how easily the mask she'd so carefully crafted was slipping away. Ellie could hear the faint buzz of Vanessa's voice carried by the wind, rising in anger, punctuated by pauses as if she were demanding something that would never come. The storm was here. Ellie didn't move, didn't flinch. She'd known this moment would come. She had allowed Vanessa to make her move, to think she was in control. But now, the curtain was falling, and all Ellie had to do was watch. The phone in her pocket buzzed, breaking the stillness. She took it out without looking away from the window, her thumb swiping across the screen. It was Roger's name on the screen. She didn't hesitate before answering, her voice low but steady. Ellie. Roger's voice came through, measured as always. Vanessa is at the front door shouting, "I've already contacted security, but it's getting volatile." Ellie glanced back out the window where Vanessa was now pacing back and forth, her body rigid with agitation. The sight of her frantic movements, so out of control, brought a small, satisfied smile to Ellie's lips. She wasn't worried. Not anymore. "Send a cease and desist," Ellie said quietly, almost matter-of-factly. "Let her know it's time to leave." Roger's voice tightened with the understanding that had long since been formed between them. "Consider it done. I'll take care of it." Ellie hung up and put the phone back in her pocket, her gaze still fixed on the porch. She watched as Vanessa stopped pacing, her arms flung wide as if pleading with the air. It was almost sad to see, but this was her own doing. Ellie had given her every opportunity to make the right choice, to see the long game. But Vanessa had played her cards recklessly, and now she was being left to play out the consequences. A car pulled into the driveway, its engine humming gently as it came to a stop. Ellie's gaze flickered briefly toward it. Dana, of course, arriving just in time to witness the end of the spectacle. She could always count on Dana to be where she was needed most. The door opened, and Dana stepped out of the car with her usual calm, poised confidence. She didn't hurry. She didn't rush to intervene. Dana was never one to act impulsively. Instead, she moved toward the front door with a purposeful step, her gaze flicking briefly to Vanessa, who had now sunk onto the steps, her hands covering her face in disbelief. It was over. The chaos was subsiding, leaving only the remnants of a battle fought by one side, with the other left standing unscathed. Ellie's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Jonah. "Please talk to me." The message was simple, direct. A plea from a man who was finally waking up to the fact that he had been complicit in Vanessa's game. Ellie stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could feel the weight of the question pressing on her, but she knew the answer. She typed her response with careful deliberation, her fingers moving across the screen with precision, as if she were laying down the final pieces of a puzzle that had taken years to complete. "You watched her bury me alive. I watched her bury herself." Ellie hit send and put the phone down, feeling the finality of the words settle over her. Jonah's involvement in Vanessa's scheme was undeniable now. He had stood by, silent and passive, while Vanessa tried to claim what wasn't hers. But the truth was clear. The fallout was not just about the inheritance. It was about the choices they had made, the damage they had caused. From the window, Ellie watched as Dana walked up to the porch, her steps calm and unhurried. Vanessa was still there, her shoulders slumped, her face streaked with the remnants of her outburst. Dana leaned down to speak with her, and though the conversation was too distant to hear, Ellie could imagine the words. A few moments later, Vanessa rose, her head bowed, her steps uncertain. She stumbled toward her car, glancing once more at the house. Her house. Or at least, it had been in her mind. The image of her walking away, defeated, was everything Ellie had hoped for. There was no more fight left in her. The reality of her loss had finally settled in. Ellie turned away from the window and moved toward the living room, her posture relaxed, but resolute. She was done with the games. The last part of the plan had unfolded exactly as she'd expected. As she sat back in her chair, she heard the soft click of the front door closing behind Dana, and a moment later, Roger's voice crackled over the phone. "I've filed the harassment notice," he said calmly, his voice the epitome of professionalism. "It's official now. Everything's in place." Ellie smiled, her eyes closing for a moment as the weight of the last few weeks finally lifted. It was done. And now, there was nothing left but the silence. The kind of silence that spoke louder than anything else, the kind of silence that only Ellie had ever truly understood. The sunlight filtered through the large windows of the Rollins estate as Ellie sat in her study, the room bathed in a warm, golden glow. The desk before her, now cleared of any distractions, had become a symbol of the finality she had long been waiting for. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she finalized the trust, the last steps of a well-executed plan. The will had been read, the consequences set into motion, and now it was time for the final seal. Her gaze fell to the screen where the trust document was open. With a few keystrokes, she updated the final clause, the only clause that mattered now. Natalie Rollins is hereby named as the sole heir to the Rollins estate. Ellie read the words one last time. It was done. The house, the property, all the memories, everything she had worked for was now set to go to her granddaughter. Natalie had been Ellie's choice from the beginning, the one who had always understood the deeper layers of their family's legacy. Ellie leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. Her mind wandered briefly to Jonah. He had been excluded. His silence, his complicity in Vanessa's plans, it had cost him everything. Ellie had given him chances, always hoping he would see through the pretense, but in the end, he had stood by. The trust was clear. Jonah Rollins is excluded due to complicity and silence. A subtle smile touched Ellie's lips. He had made his choice, and now he would live with it. As she pressed the final save button, a sense of relief washed over her. The plan that had been years in the making was now complete. A few hours later, Ellie drove toward the community center she had funded with the proceeds from her estate. A girls' program that had become a passion project for her in her later years. It had been one of the few things that had kept her heart light in a family full of manipulation and control. She parked the car and walked toward the entrance, the familiar sound of children's laughter filling the air as she stepped inside. The building was modest but filled with life, a reflection of the work Ellie had supported for so long. Inside, a group of volunteers was gathered around, organizing supplies and talking about upcoming events. Ellie smiled as one of them, a young woman with bright eyes and a hopeful demeanor, walked up to her. "Ellie," the volunteer said, her voice warm, "thank you again for all that you've done here. This place, it's changed lives. We wouldn't be where we are without your support." Ellie smiled, the weight of her years of work pressing down on her shoulders in a comforting way. "I didn't just leave money," she said softly, her gaze steady. "I left truth." The volunteer smiled, but Ellie could see the question in her eyes. "What do you mean by that?" the woman asked, a curious tilt to her head. Ellie chuckled softly, a knowing smile crossing her face. "Sign everything." "Early," she said, her voice light, but there was a deeper meaning beneath the words. She had learned the hard way that truth, and the legacy of that truth, was worth more than money could ever buy. Just then, one of the young girls from the program ran over to Ellie, her eyes wide with excitement. "Miss Ellie, look, I made this for you." She held up a crumpled piece of construction paper, a hasty drawing of a house with a smiley face in the window. Ellie's heart softened. "You're going to make a great leader one day," Ellie said, bending down to give the girl a soft hug. The girl beamed, and Ellie felt a warmth spread through her chest, knowing that the future was in good hands. As she straightened up, Ellie's phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the screen, her expression unreadable for a moment. It was a message from Dana. Jonah wants to talk. He's asking for a meeting. Ellie put the phone down, letting the message sit unanswered for the time being. She had already made her decisions. Jonah had chosen his path, and now he would have to live with the consequences. There was no turning back. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Ellie returned to the estate, her steps steady but contemplative. She had given everything she had to the people who mattered most. Now, the estate would continue to flourish, and the programs she had supported would carry her legacy forward. Her family's secrets, the lies, and the betrayals would fade into the past. The estate was no longer just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, of the power of truth, even when it had to be fought for. And as Ellie stood in the foyer of her home, gazing at the portraits on the walls, she knew one thing for certain: she had secured her legacy, and it would be remembered. The invitation arrived on a Sunday morning, a crisp envelope tucked between the Sunday paper and the cup of coffee that sat untouched on Ellie's kitchen counter. It was a simple affair, printed in elegant script, but Ellie knew the weight of the words inside. Vanessa Rollins cordially invites you to a brunch to discuss family matters and reconciliation. It was dated for the following Saturday, and Ellie didn't need to read any further to know what was being asked of her. A reconciliation. A moment to heal. As if the gaping chasm between them could be mended with a few mimosas and soft words. The audacity of it made Ellie smile. The kind of smile that came from years of watching people underestimate her. She placed the invitation aside and returned to the mundane morning tasks. There would be no brunch. Not for her. Not this time. The envelope remained unopened, a symbol of Vanessa's hope and Ellie's resolve. The thought of it lingered in her mind, but it was fleeting. There was no need to meet. No need to entertain the charade any longer. Vanessa had already made her choices, and Ellie had long since made hers. Later that afternoon, Ellie sat in the study, the sun filtering through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. With a sigh, she picked up a pen and wrote a short, simple note to accompany the return of the invitation. She sealed it carefully and instructed the butler to send it back via express mail. The will has already spoken. She leaned back in her chair and let out a quiet breath. It was done. The final decision had been made, and there was nothing left to say. By the time Ellie's note had been delivered, the tension at the Rollins estate had already begun to shift. Vanessa, in her typical fashion, took to social media to make her feelings known. The post was as passive-aggressive as expected. "Some people hate healing," it read, accompanied by a carefully chosen photo of her and Jonah from happier times, a time when things had been simpler, when she had still believed the game was hers to win. Vanessa's followers took the bait, as always. They liked, they commented, they offered their condolences. But Ellie's response was the quiet kind of defiance. No retort, no public defense. Her absence at the brunch spoke louder than any online comment ever could. But the ripple effects continued. Vanessa had hoped for a moment of unity, a chance to pull Ellie back into her orbit. Instead, she was met with silence. Her post faded into the digital ether as the reality of Ellie's choice set in. There would be no reunion. There would be no peace. Natalie, ever the silent observer, had been waiting for her moment. It came that evening when she unfollowed her mother publicly on social media. The gesture was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but to those who knew the Rollins family, it was a statement as loud as any confrontation. She didn't need to say anything. The act spoke for her. Vanessa's days of orchestrating anything in this family were over. Ellie smiled to herself as she saw the news later that evening. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of recognition. The truth was settling in. Her choices had been hard, But they had been right. The future was now secure, in more ways than one. Later that week, Dana hosted a small celebration in the backyard of the estate. The evening was relaxed, a quiet gathering of the few people who had stood by Ellie through the years. There were no grand speeches, no lavish toasts. It was simply a moment of acknowledgement, the kind of quiet celebration that Ellie preferred. To clean exits. Dana toasted with a glass of champagne, her voice light but filled with meaning. The words hung in the air, a fitting tribute to the way things had played out. No drama, no accusations, just the slow, inevitable unraveling of the story. The people who mattered had already moved on. The others, well, they would eventually catch up. Ellie raised her glass, her eyes meeting Dana's. The weight of everything they had endured together settled between them, a shared understanding. Dana had always been the one who saw through the pretenses, the one who knew when to act, when to wait, and when to say nothing at all. Ellie took a sip of her drink, savoring the moment. The truth, after all, had a way of making itself known. The following day, Roger delivered the certified court recognition of the will's execution. The legalities were over, and the finality of it was undeniable. Ellie read through the papers with a steady hand, not surprised by anything she saw. It had been a long time coming, but now it was done. There was no more room for doubt. As she set the papers aside, Ellie allowed herself a moment of peace. The battles had been fought, the right decisions made, and the legacy she had worked so hard to secure was now in place. She had done everything she could for the people she loved, for the truth. And now, the future was hers to shape. The phone buzzed on the desk, but Ellie ignored it for a moment. She didn't need to answer right away. The silence that followed was the most comforting thing she had known in years. The estate, the legacy, and the truth. These were the things that would endure. The rest was irrelevant now. The evening air was warm and inviting, the sky streaked with soft shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The garden at the Rollins estate was alive with quiet chatter and the delicate sound of clinking glasses. The scene could have been a painting, vivid, calm, and serene. Tea lights hung from the branches of the large oak tree, casting soft pools of light across the long dining table that stretched beneath it. Soft laughter filled the air, but there was no chaos, no frenzy. Just quiet moments shared between friends, a moment of reflection after everything that had unfolded. Ellie stood near the garden's edge, watching as her guests mingled, exchanging stories and laughter. The same guests who had stood by her through thick and thin. Dana, ever the poised leader, moved between people, her smile both warm and knowing. She was the steady hand in this storm, always ready to offer a quiet word of encouragement or a sharp observation when needed. The night was not about drama or grandeur. It was about what had been earned, about the people who remained, those who had weathered the storms together and come out stronger on the other side. And Ellie? She had fought for her place in the world, and now it was time for the world to see her quiet victory. As the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the hills, the soft sound of clinking glasses rose. Dana stood, her wine glass raised, and a hush fell over the guests as they turned their attention to her. "To the woman who let a liar speak before truth did," Dana toasted, her voice rich with meaning. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had transpired. Ellie's smile was small, but it was enough. The truth had been slow to reveal itself, but it had come. And now, in the quiet of this garden, the final chapter was being written. Ellie's eyes met Dana's across the table, a silent exchange between them. They both knew the power of patience, the power of waiting for the right moment. The game was over. The pieces had been placed, and now, the future would be what they made of it. At the far end of the garden, Natalie stood near the sound system, her fingers lightly brushing the controls as she set the music to play softly in the background. Her movements were deliberate, confident. She was no longer the silent observer. She was a part of this new world that Ellie had fought to build. A world where truth mattered, where the lies had been exposed, and where the people who mattered most had found their way forward. As the first notes of music floated through the air, Ellie felt the weight of the past few months begin to lift. Everything she had worked for, every hard decision she had made, had led to this moment. The tension in the air had dissipated. There was peace now. The soft ding of an incoming email broke the silence. Ellie glanced at her phone, her fingers moving automatically to open it. It was from Roger. The subject line was clear: all legal challenges denied. Ellie read through the email, her expression calm but knowing. Roger had kept his word. The last of the legal challenges had been swiftly dismissed. The will was final. The estate, the legacy, the truth. Everything was now sealed. No one could touch it. Vanessa had played her hand, and now, there was no way back. Ellie put the phone down, her gaze lifting back to the garden. The guests were already beginning to settle into their seats, the conversations continuing with the ease of people who had long since let go of the past. Dana had already taken her seat at the table, a glass of wine in hand, ready to enjoy the evening. The world, for the first time in years, felt still. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the tree overhead, and Ellie's thoughts briefly drifted to Jonah. The text from him had been received, but the words were still lingering in her mind. The message was a simple plea. "Please talk to me." Ellie hadn't responded. There was no need. Jonah had been complicit. He had stayed silent when it mattered most. His silence had sealed his fate just as much as Vanessa's lies had sealed hers. And now it was time for him to face the consequences. Ellie knew this path wasn't just about the estate. It was about understanding where loyalty had been, and where it had been betrayed. Jonah would learn that lesson in his own time. Ellie had no more to give. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts, and Ellie looked up to see Jonah standing on the porch. He hesitated for a moment, his face drawn, his expression conflicted, before he stepped into the garden. But his presence no longer held the weight it once did. His part in this had already been written. Ellie didn't move, didn't speak. She simply let him approach. And as he did, she gave him one last, steady look. A look that spoke of everything she had fought for, everything she had secured. Vanessa's absence, meanwhile, was felt. The woman who had once tried to control everything had gone silent. Ellie knew where she was, what she was doing, or rather, what she wasn't doing. She had nothing left. She had been defeated by her own hand, and there was no going back. The party, the final gathering, had been one of quiet victory. A victory not over people, but over everything that had tried to tear her down. And now, the future was hers. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes after the storm has passed, when everything has been settled, when the dust has finally settled around you. Ellie walked through the rooms of the Rollins estate, her steps deliberate, her gaze lingering on the familiar details, the photographs on the walls, the well-worn furniture, the perfectly arranged flowers on the dining table. Every corner, every inch of the house was a reminder of the life she had built, the life she had fought for. She walked slowly through the hallway, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the banister, her mind quiet as she surveyed the home that was now her legacy. The rooms were tidy, organized. The estate had been transferred. Officially, legally, irrevocably. The title was now in Natalie's name. The estate had been hers for decades. But now, the house had found a new owner, her granddaughter. Ellie smiled softly as she stepped into the study, where the last remnants of the day's events still lingered. The final page of her real will was framed on the wall, an inconspicuous reminder of how things had truly played out. The will that had been hidden in plain sight, the one Vanessa would never have imagined, the one that was far more powerful than any false claim could have been. Ellie stood in front of it for a moment, the weight of everything settling in. The final act was complete. She had made her choice, and now the truth was there, for anyone who cared to look. She stepped back, taking in the framed document one last time, and let the gravity of it sink in. Vanessa had read a fake will aloud at the party, assuming the entire family was blind to her intentions. But Ellie had already set everything in motion. The truth had been tucked away, signed, sealed, and waiting. All Vanessa's scheming had only led to one thing: a public display of her own downfall. Ellie walked over to the desk, where a small box rested. Natalie approached quietly from the doorway, carrying the fake will with her, the one that had been read aloud in front of everyone. It looked out of place now, a relic of a farce that had come and gone. Natalie looked at her grandmother and held up the fake will. "The day Mom embarrassed herself," she said, her voice cool and measured, a small smile curving her lips. Ellie chuckled softly. "Put it next to the teacups," she replied with a grin, her eyes lighting up as she imagined the absurdity of it all. The will that had been the centerpiece of Vanessa's grand plan, now relegated to a shadow box, nothing more than a souvenir of the day a liar's mask was ripped off. Natalie carefully placed the document in the box, the glass lid sealing it with a soft click. The light from the chandelier above caught the frame just right, casting a glow on the paper. It would be a conversation piece, a reminder of the way things had unfolded. No one would ever forget the day Vanessa had tried to claim it all, only to watch her dreams crumble in front of an audience of witnesses. Dana entered the room just as Ellie stepped back, her glass of champagne in hand, a knowing smile on her face. "To clean exits," she said softly, raising her glass in a silent toast to everything that had been accomplished. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. No more theatrics, no more games, just the final chapter. Ellie raised her own glass, her smile barely visible as she met Dana's eyes. She didn't need to say anything. The silence between them spoke volumes. They had navigated the storm, and now they could finally breathe. The truth had won. The rest of the world would eventually catch up. As the music played softly in the background, Ellie took a slow sip from her glass. She looked around the room, at the framed documents, at the people who had stood by her, at the house that had been her home for so long. There would be no more betrayals, no more deception. The legacy she had built would endure, and it would be remembered for what it truly was. Ellie exhaled deeply, her mind quiet. "And that's how it ends," she said softly, as if to herself. The words were final, almost whispered. The door clicked open and Roger stepped inside, his usual calm demeanor unbroken. "The final legalities are taken care of," he said, his voice steady, professional. "Everything is in place." Ellie nodded, her gaze steady as she looked at him. There was nothing left to say. The fight had been long, but it was over now. Ellie had secured everything that mattered. And as she looked around the room, at the house, at her family, at the future, she knew she had done what was right. Vanessa, for all her plotting, would never understand the depth of Ellie's vision. She would never understand the power of truth. The phone buzzed again on the desk, but Ellie didn't reach for it. There was no need. She had already won. Her legacy was set.